This year sees the latest in computer research and development with the Johnniac, the successor in number-crunching power and titular conceit of ENIAC. Why so many of these computers are christened variants of the word maniac is left to the reader's imagination. The name is also inspired by John von Neumann, one of the architects of the Trinity detonation at Los Alamos. This early enterprise certainly had an air of the maniacal about it, as even many of those who participated in it would later attest. The UNIVAC, developed in 1951, is the first computer to use magnetic tape in addition to punch cards and other more rudimentary means of data storage. When scientists Watson and Crick announced their discovery of DNA this year, they seem, wittingly or no, to adopt the metaphor of data tape to describe this essential building block for life, where the magnetic tape is a medium for inscribing or rewriting a series of ones or zeros, active and passive states. DNA is visualized as a kind of ribbon on which 4 different data types are carried in the form of separate proteins. Here, too, reciprocally, as computer technology and the mysteries of biological consciousness are imagined in tandem, influencing and resembling one another. Whether the resemblance is coincidental or reflects an intrinsic similarity isn't entirely clear. Maybe it's one of those dense questions that lies at the limits of human contemplation or computational power. The kinship between the computer and the mind suggests that the mind, like the computer, might be programmable. Unbeknownst to the general American population, and in coincidental tandem with this separate DNA research, a covert CIA operation dubbed Project Artichoke has gotten fully underway in the more secretive echelons of the U.S. intelligence and scientific communities. Artichoke is largely a product of the ongoing Korean War, the anxieties provoked by the strange behavior of American POWs, whose allegiances had been so readily manipulated by their Chinese captors that it was feared the enemy had unlocked some means of mechanically controlling the human will, led American strategists to perceive a need to research the possibilities of mind control. After all, if the communists had discovered how to directly influence the psyche, this would put the United States at a decided disadvantage in the struggle between collectivism and capitalism for global dominance, that ongoing conflict growing to be known more and more as the Cold War. Though the nervous CIA analysts behind Artichoke imagined mind control as a potential scientific reality, it's more accurate to describe it as a kind of fairy tale or ghost story, an unsubstantiated rumor. The Chinese techniques for compelling prisoners to offer up desired attitudes and actions, though clever in a cruel kind of way, are scarcely supernatural, nor do they require any esoteric technologies. Rather, they involve giving the most humiliating jobs to the highest-ranking prisoners to disrupt the chain of command, disorienting prisoners through the use of stress positions and sleep deprivation, and linking basic amenities with participation in political indoctrination classes. Maybe American society concocts this fantastical explanation for the Chinese POW phenomenon rather than assessing it realistically, because the American press and popular culture tend to elide the more disturbing aspects of large-scale conflict. In the movies, hypnosis is typically a painless process. David's parents in this year's Invaders from Mars experience only the fleeting pinch as the probes are inserted into the backs of their necks. The bar crowd in Invasion USA need only stare into a twirling glass of brandy. How much easier to imagine this than the horrors the POWs had to endure in real life. One arena in which the Soviets are running ahead of the Americans in the comprehensive feud between the two nations is that of cheaply made full-color narrative film. The main reason for this advantage, though, is that huge quantities of unused color film stock were among the spoils of their victory over Nazi Germany. This was another consequence of the Hitler regime's unwise decision to maintain a mixed-use economy until 1943, even as the Allied powers mobilized for all-out war. Nevertheless, such prioritizing of civilian technologies won the Germans significant advances in the emerging field of television, which the Allies had largely abandoned not long after the 1939 World's Fair. Germany's occupiers learned in sifting through the nation's smoking ruins that, at least compared to their interminably rationed American counterparts, the German government developed a relatively significant complement of regular television programming during the war. In retrospect, the decision to invest so heavily in the frivolity of moving image media seems like yet another of Hitler's mad caprices, but it makes a certain kind of sense. Particularly after Stalingrad and the Normandy landings made eventual German defeat a virtual certainty, the need to influence the besieged nation's population via propaganda doubtless became acute, lest they turned to open revolt. Indeed, the decision was a testament to the moving picture's unique power to influence the mind as much as evidence that the mind of the nation's leader had become unhinged. 7 years later, and at a time when Hollywood films were shot in full color only at great expense, the Soviet Union availed itself of its hard-earned good fortune to release a lovely cinematic extravaganza at a relatively affordable price. Sadko, a screen adaptation of a classic opera by Tsarist Russian composer Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakoff, who was in turn inspired by a centuries-old fairy tale. The director, Alexander Ptushko, had cut his teeth on various stop-motion animated children's movies before the war interrupted most such endeavors. About a century earlier, Rimsky-Korsakoff composed Sadko, one of his major works, just after returning from a months-long sea voyage in which the youthful musician visited, among other sights, London's Crystal Palace, a wonder of the romantic modern era built to house the 1851 Great Exhibition, a progenitor of the World's Fair. He also called on New York when the United States was in the throes of a civil war. This all transpired in the context of a separate conflict that stood to break out between Russia and Britain, one Korsakoff's fleet had orders to prepare for by docking in American ports. There they could harass the British Navy in the Western Atlantic should the need arise. Korsakoff's opera would later incorporate many of the elements of this seafaring journey: the sense of danger on the high seas, secret worlds replete with esoteric liminal knowledge, and the joy of returning to the shores of home. For Ptushko, the Guslar's journey in Sadko resembles the American island-hopping campaign the Soviets had so recently watched threaten shores adjacent to their own. His crew alights on more than one island beachhead and encounters resistance on more than one beach. Sailing the deep sea, they endure ferocious storms and the wrath of airborne enemies. Eventually their ship sinks to the bottom. Whether Ptushko or Soviet culture at large holds a particular fascination with the wrath and the hardships of the American Navy is hard to say. With the closing of the Iron Curtain, and considering the tendency of those in the West to see everything through the lens of communist contagion, not much is known about Soviet culture, but it seems a safe bet. A certain collective habit of mind has overtaken America since the war, a fact lamented in a two-part Harper's Magazine article, The Mass-Produced Suburbs. Author Harry Henderson describes housing developments in which those who read too many books, expressed unusual opinions, thought too much, or refused to go along with silly games at parties were often regarded as too brainy or stuck up or too good for the rest of us. For the bookworms or the unusually opinionated, it's little wonder that the communist ideology would be such a fearsome thing. Not necessarily because of the literal prospect that Soviet paratroopers might drop down on the neighborhood baseball field, but because many already see in their surroundings something like the culture of socialist conformity and feel helpless to oppose it. Invaders from Mars's alert and distrustful young David seems tailor-made to make Henderson's point. An eerie, deeply paranoid film, Invaders has a stunned David look on as an alien infiltration force burrows into a field behind his family backyard. He's aided in this by a small retail telescope his parents recently gifted him to encourage his natural curiosity about the stars. Not in the sense that he uses it to spy the alighting saucer, but that the telescope is the only reason the window to his room is open at 4:45 in the morning. He's just gotten through using the apparatus to spot a rare stellar alignment. Aliens subsequently infest the minds of David's unwitting parents and his father, who works at the local defense plant, then grants the aliens access to the highest levers of power in town. All this culminates in the revelation that the boy's merely dreaming. The movie presents many potential stressors that may have coaxed his nightmare, among them his father's job, which is, after all rationalizations and qualifications aside, to manufacture instruments of death. Nightmare fuel in itself, the plant also makes the town a target of the nuclear-armed Russians. When the alien-possessed parents start acting hostile to David, the sense is one of an existing resentment made forthright, more than one conjured from whole cloth. What's the point of George's professional existence, after all, if not to sustain this war machine that has already blighted the world for the dozen-plus years since conflict broke out in Eurasia? Even if we grant the proposition that communist aggression is a menace to be resisted with the same determination as the Nazis were resisted, where does it all end? Will peace and prosperity finally be realized with the 3-year-old Korean conflict now over? Or will another crisis simply follow in its wake? When David looks up in the sky through his telescope, is he nursing wonder about the possibilities for life on other worlds? Or is he simply aping his father's suspicions and mistrust? Partly a responsibility prerequisite to his salary, partly an ever-present cultural undercurrent of his time. Is this unending vigilance really all there is to it? In this year's Robot Monster, episode 107, the alien invasion also turns out to be a boy's uneasy dream. Young Johnny, who has presumably been roasting too long in the afternoon sun after a family picnic, sinks into a reverie regarding 2 marauding space gorillas in diving helmets. In quest of Lieben's realm, the aliens blithely obliterate the entire human race with a death ray, with the exception of Johnny and his family, who, luckily enough, inoculated themselves with an experimental concoction just before the attack. Like David's, Johnny's kin and social support group are made up disproportionately of scientists and engineer types. Although unlike David's, Johnny's compatriots are engaged in a scientific enterprise that's strictly aimed at peaceful progress, a serum that will cure all known diseases. That their technology is fanciful, whereas David's towns and Invaders from Mars is drearily, lethally real, is also worthy of note. Technology's more benevolent ends are always easier imagined, their deadly counterparts more readily actualized. The windfalls of programs like Atoms for Peace are more likely to be splashed across the cover of the latest amazing stories, but advancements in the art of mass death are coming fast and furious in the sprouting of mushroom clouds all along the Pacific atolls. Robot monsters off-world simians trade intelligence and advance their conquest through the use of flat-screen televisions that work as closed-circuit communications devices. Unless it's to provide proof of life, the need for the visual component of the communication is never made clear. The diving helmeted creatures, lacking faces, have no capacity for facial expression. In planning their resistance, the isolated family determines to fall back to an orbiting space station, humanity's only other surviving redoubt, but fear they'll be done in by friendly fire if they don't first announce their approach. To this end, they contrive to hijack the alien television, whereon Roy, Johnny's father, hopes to rewire it for broadcast as well as transmission. Their fight is all for nothing. Relentlessly, the gorilla couple gain the upper hand, and Johnny's awakening finds the family 2-1, dead or incapacitated. But the idea of expanding the television receiver's palette of uses to include first communications and then broadcasting functions is yet another indicator of a society still searching for the outer bounds of television's potential. The V-2 rocket technology borrowed from the Germans has progressed by 1953 to suborbital space flights, conducted, as usual, in a sort of competitive tandem by the United States and the Soviet Union, using Aerobee and Rasputin Yar missiles, respectively. Where the V-2 was designed to follow a parabolic course to a specific terrestrial destination, typically to blow that destination up, these successors enhance high-altitude photography and other modes of atmospheric data gathering in the interest of improved meteorological prediction. In short, they go straight up. Among the ultimate goals of this technology is the eventual insertion of something called an artificial satellite into near-Earth orbit. Taking the celestial relationship between the Earth and the Moon as a model, the advocates of this peculiar idea seem to want to build a kind of man-made moon that will revolve around our planet the way the natural moon does, but at a much lower altitude and a much greater speed. The science behind this idea seems clear to engineers, but scarcely intuitive to the laity, so that when General Green explains it in Project Moonbase, it makes no sense at all.
It rotates completely around the Earth in a transpolar orbit about 10 times a day. At present, the station is in a state of freefall.
Freefall? Could you explain that a little more?
Well, of course. When we speak of freefall, we simply mean that the station and everything in it are moving around the Earth at a speed which is great enough so that it cannot fall toward the Earth. But it is also moving at a speed which is not great enough in order to enable it to go out into space. Therefore, the forces of gravity and speed are now in balance. And as a result, nothing in the station has any weight.
The recipient of Green's baffling pedantry is one Polly Prattles, muckraking female reporter, there's that again, who, in typical female fashion, ignores the bulk of the general's impenetrable exegesis to focus on the matter of weight.
No, wait. What a wonderful idea. You mean if I went there, I wouldn't weigh anything?
The general cools Polly's jets on the possibility of joining the space station and in the process deftly heaps shame on her for carrying an unfeminine figure.
At the time, it cost the government just about $300 a pound to send anything to the station.
He explains.
And consequently, our personnel must all weigh less than 160 pounds.
The exchange does the work of conveying the general's contempt for Polly, this being a contempt the writers would seem to like the audience to feel in turn, and one the general is scarcely concealing in any case. More interesting here is his evocation of another cognitive dissonance to couple with the one above about floating by plummeting, falling but never landing, orbit's peculiar dance-like dialectic. How is it, Polly puzzles with a furrowed brow, that one must be a certain weight to become weightless? Colonel Bright-Ice, the general briefs, will spearhead an excursion from the space station to the moon to photograph its dark side. The real-life Aero B rockets conduct similar tasks, considering 1953's limited technology in comparison to Robert Heinlein's imagined 1970. Motion picture and still cameras mounted on their noses film the atmosphere and Earth from unprecedented heights. The colonel's bona fides for the job include having flown the mission that put the space station in orbit in the first place. This delights the suffragist Polly.
I'm so glad a girl is going to do it, and so will all my readers be.
Though she appreciates that the mission will advance the cause of women, the utility of photographing the dark side of the moon otherwise escapes her. Rather than conduct her line of inquiry directly, she attributes it to her editor, an old bear whom nothing suits. She relates his opinion that the space program is a
boondoggle, just another way of wasting tax money.
This provides an occasion for another extended oratory from the general.
Maybe someday the statesmen will make military bases and military men unnecessary. If so, fine. But in the meantime, if there is going to be a base on the moon, and there will be, it's my business to see that it's in safe hands. Our own. Ma'am, the most important thing in the world to me is the military security of the United States. And I'm not in the least bit apologetic for my attitude.
Objections to this passive-aggressive outburst abound. Why are bases on the moon inevitable? Doesn't this beg Polly's question regarding the space program's usefulness in the first place? And is it not a foundational characteristic of human psychology that one always imagines one's own hands to be the safest place for power to reside? The Russians surely think likewise. Absent a supporting ideological justification, the only sensible thing for Polly to do here is chalk this sentiment up to pure nativism, the same impulse that compels one to root implacably for the home baseball team. The paradigm the general proposes is once again one of perpetual unreasoned expansion, first to the moon, then to Mars and Venus, then beyond, all in the interest not of voyage and discovery, of simply of preventing the other boys, the ones on the Russian team, from getting there first. And then there's this matter of letting the girls play. Unsurprisingly, given his taste for the unilateral wielding of power, the general has made the U.S. Army in 1970 a less than safe environment for women of high rank. When he gets Bright Ice alone under the pretense of a classified briefing, he threatens her with a physical assault, a spanking, to be exact. Colonel Bright Ice angrily calls his bluff.
Thank you.
If you do, I'll shout the whole place down.
I might add that this room is soundproof.
Is his unnerving rejoinder. Considering Project Moonbase's male territorialism, it's easy to expect a reincorporation of the woman into the domestic sphere at the end. That is, you think Bright Ice is going to wind up married to Major Moore, and will thereon happily resign to life at home with the kids. This does happen halfway. The couple weds, but in the context of Bright Ice's promotion to Brigadier General, and the female as signifier is also recuperated from the domestic sphere when the U.S. President is revealed to be a woman as well. As with Invaders from Mars, Project Moonbase awards lead billing to its female star. Thus does the film continue a trend in our collection of presenting women in central roles, women with ambiguous relationships regarding traditional male expectations. The corpse vanishes, it's true, gives Luana Walters as Patricia Hunter second place in the opening titles, but that's in favor of the great Bela Lugosi. Patricia, will recall, nurses a peculiar Thanatos drive at the heart of her orchid-sniffing journalistic odyssey. And something correlative happens here with Colonel Bright Ice. For one, there's the matter of her chosen profession. Heinlein and company predict a return to Cold War stalemate by 1970. But today, 3 years into the hot, bloody Korean War, associating American military officers with mass death is, for better or worse, pretty easy to do. The entire enterprise also unfolds against a gloomy backdrop. The movie's second half is mostly set inside the tomb-like lunar lander, and the other scenes transpire on the moon's barren surface. Hundreds of thousands of miles divide these stranded pioneers from their community of fellow humans. In this sense, the couple becomes an embodiment of the departed soul as a symbol, a manifestation of the departed soul in the physical universe. After all, who's ever been kept from humanity by such vast distance but the dead? In the film's darkest moment, the Major finds himself in a suit marching across the lunar surface, low on air and near to losing consciousness. In the lander, meanwhile, Bright Ice sits at a control panel abutting a massive viewplate on which his progress, or lack thereof, is being put up for exhibition.
You must get back, Bill.
She exhorts him as he stumbles groggily across the screen.
You must. Come in, Bill.
After saying this, though, she falls eerily silent. Bill collapses and is reduced to clawing feebly along, digging wavy furrows in the moon dust.
I'm so cold.
He stammers.
I'm so cold.
Bright Ice lowers the ship's hoist for him, but offers no words of comfort in what appear to be his final moments. She quietly manipulates the panel's machinery and watches the viewplate as we look on in turn, seeing only the back of her head. If her voice registers any emotion, we can't see it. If she has any words of comfort for Bill in his potentially mortal throes, she doesn't share them. She just watches, still and silent, no more a sentient witness to his passing than the moon itself.